Galatians chapter 1. One-fifth of the entire letter of Galatians contains Paul's autobiography. This portion actually goes through verses 2 through verse 14. And it can be broken up into two major sections in really here. And so if you've looked, we have, verse 11 starts in one section and ends at verse 24. And then in chapter 2, it goes from verse 1 through 14, really the two major blocks of his autobiography. And I would say oftentimes the stuff in Galatians is it like sometimes can be a nice reference point. But, if we're inclined to read, Galatians and Ephesians and some of these other letters, and we'd like to get to the good stuff, we can generally skim over Galatians 1 and Galatians 2 and get to the stuff where he's, causing controversy, where he likes to, get people riled up. And we try to read through as fast as we can because we want to get to the good stuff. And I'll admit, I have at times fallen into that trap. I've come across, and I just want to get to, if you look at the chapter 3, verse 1, where he says, "You foolish Galatians," yeah, that's the part I want to read. Yeah, let them have it, all right? And so I would skim over some of this other stuff, and and I would only read it from like a historical perspective, if I wanted to fill in the gaps there in like in Acts chapter 9 or something like that. And then as we approach this study, I'm forced to look at it a little bit differently. I don't look at it from the standpoint of, strictly educational, but I'm forced to think about it now. How does this connect with us? How do we look at this? How does this? I can't teach it to you guys like it, like it doesn't matter. And so I slow down. And I start to read, and as I've read and interacted with Galatians, the few times before I've taught it, something started to sort of like, I don't want to say leaping off the page, but I felt like it literally leaps off the page at me. Where I'm like, man, I wish I had slowed down sooner and saw what I think Paul is saying here a lot sooner. And you'll see something here in verses 11 through 24 is this I think the central truth that we're going to encounter today is that the gospel message is God's message. See, the gospel message is God's message to us. The gospel is God's. The gospel is created by God, formed by God. It is made by God, generated by God. It is furthered by God. It is God's and God's alone. And at times, organizations, churches, I think, can accidentally, maybe sometimes, maybe some do it on purpose, and they can make the gospel about men or about people, about social issues of the day, whatever. But I think what we accidentally do when we do that is we end up changing what the gospel is, and we miss it. See, social issues, things like that are all very important things of our day. But I think when we see the gospel for what it is, and how it is God's and what He intends it to be, it allows us to handle issues and variety of problems and all that stuff. It helps us see those differently because it's like the gospel radiates onto it. See, when we bring the gospel back to what it is, and we see it for what it is, it changes how we approach it. And so you're going to see how Paul sets this up, but he goes in verse 11. So what I'm going to do is we'll end up reading like verses 11 through 17, and we'll interact with it as we read through it, and then we'll end up slowing down and sort of putting it all together. But he says there in verse 11, he says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel." See how he sort of starts that off right off the get-go. He's like, what I'm preaching to you is not mankind's. It's not people's. It was not generated by humans. This is something different. So right off the get-go, remember, we talked about it last week and the week before that, where so many were so quickly deserting him for a different gospel. That wasn't a real gospel, but, some people tried to call it that. And he sort of was like, yeah, but no. Same here. He's like, look, what I'm coming to you with is a gospel that was not generated or created by man. He said, "For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." And that can make us a little skeptical. I mean, I got a message too. Y'all are all supposed to give me lots of money. God told me. It makes us a little skeptical. And in some ways, rightly so. And I think Paul knows that when he's writing, so he sets this up. But I mean, he's speaking the truth because there's an encounter listed in Acts chapter 9 by an individual by the name of Luke. And you guys will be, if you're not in a community group, I encourage you to read Acts 9 just to supplement this. But in Acts 9, what is described as Paul, a devout Jew and Pharisee, has been given permission to lead the persecution and arrest of Christians in the city of Damascus. And at that time, he was going by the name of Saul. And on there, Jesus reveals himself to Paul. And Paul, through this earth-shattering experience, and then through the teaching of an individual by the name of Ananias, came to a saving knowledge of Jesus. And so when he starts off, when he says in verse 12, "I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through the revelation of Jesus Christ," what Paul means is, I was pretty much knocked to my feet, and Jesus is like, "Hey, stop it." And I listened. This was earth-shattering to me, and Paul is not hiding. He knows it probably sounds a little weird, but it was his experience and exactly what he went through. And then he sets it up there in verse 13. So he explains this a little bit more. He says, "For you heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." It would make zero sense for a guy who had already been way over excelled far beyond his peers in his own faith, practice, religion, country. It would make no sense to be already ahead of the game and decide to go meh and go bottom of the totem pole and go follow something else if something dramatic didn't happen to him. Because nothing in Paul's life from that point on, he literally cut off his financial supply. He cut off his fame. He cut off the ability of him being a future teacher. He literally, hamstrung himself. So it's not like a nobody to I had an experience became a somebody. He was a somebody, had an experience, and became a nobody. So it's not following the line of of thought wouldn't you would expect a miraculous thing to happen? Or if you're really skeptical about this in the first place, it doesn't really make sense. Are you guys tracking with that sort of like line here? I think that's what we gotta draw that out is, it's not, we're naturally right to be skeptical. If someone was to come up to us and say, I had this encounter with a butterfly and it told me this, yes. Okay, I got nothing. And I've had that, okay? That's why I say the butterfly comment. You don't really have anywhere to go with that. So a something to I had this experience now, or I've become a nothing to a something. This is Paul was something beyond a something, had it and became a nothing. So he's setting this up. And just to sort of give a little more background to his former life of Judaism and how he was advancing in Judaism way beyond that of his own people and his own peers. He says it there in Philippians. He says in Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, he gives this brief summary of how Jewish he was. He says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. Now, we're jumping in the middle of this in the Philippians, right? He says, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. What he says is, if you really think that you're the coolest Jew to ever exist, let me tell you, you got nothing on me. Because I was circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He could actually track his family line, which is a huge deal back then. As to the law, a Pharisee. Oh, you think you practice the law? Ha! I did the law and more, buddy. I blew you away. I was a Pharisee. As to zeal, as to passion, as he continues to say in Philippians 3:6, I was a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, I was blameless. Nobody had anything on me. I could have become president of Israel if that existed, and the press could have dug and dug and dug and dug, and they would have found nothing. Not a single recording of me saying anything, anywhere, at any point in time whatsoever to cause any problems. Wouldn't that be incredible to encounter nowadays? You're blameless. No, I actually am. Nah, totally. Nope, don't believe it. Because we don't. But here is Paul straight up confidently, this is who I was. He just straight up says, I was a very rare breed. He throws it all away because of this revelation, this encounter that he had with Jesus Christ. It makes no sense. I am trying to kill you. I have changed my mind. I am now actually going to be on the receiving side of those you're trying to kill. This is what he meant when he says, I was advanced way beyond others. Talking first in the graduating class of Pharisee awesomeness. That was Paul. And he says in verse 14, he also says this other phrase, which I think we should pause at a little bit, where he says, I was extremely zealous, was I for the traditions of my fathers. And I want to bring this out just for, a few reasons. One of those is as we read and interact with Scripture, we should always try to make special note for phrases or terminology that we feel is loaded with meaning. Even if it's not necessarily loaded, I think we should make note of it. Because when we encounter a phrase like traditions of my fathers, what does he mean by traditions and who's this fathers that he's talking about? It should be one of those, let's pause, maybe study this a little bit and see what he has to say. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, there's Pharisees and scribes that came to visit Jesus from Jerusalem, and they said to him, why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. And so this phrase, traditions of the elders, traditions of the father, was very generally used to refer to, and you had the law as God gave it, And what the Pharisees had done slowly over time is added a level of protective laws, thoughts, mindsets, whose goal was to protect the law from ever being broken. If you just followed all these other things, then you would never have a chance of breaking the actual law, and therefore you could be blameless. And so a lot of scholars believe that this is generally just a reference to the Pharisee way of thought. Was, yes, there's the law, we will obey that, but to make sure that we never break the law, we also follow an expanded set of rules and regulations that would help guard us. Some people believe that phrase means that. Some, especially in this context, believes he's literally just referring to Judaism in its entirety, of his forefathers. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, things like that. Either way, I don't think it changes anything, but the reason I bring it out is as you study, if you encounter these phrases loaded with meaning, I think it is good to pause and to work through what this could potentially mean. It might not have any bearings, but it might. And so this is one of those, now you can read the Bible better. So let's keep going there, all right? And so look at verse 15 now. He says, "But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." And what's fascinating with Paul's journey and what he's describing here is there's a distinct difference between, there's this group of teachers, these Judaizers, these people who, they were Christians who believed that you had to obey the law in order to prove that you were saved. And they were trying to place Gentile Christians under this Jewish law system. They're called Judaizers, and they generally followed Paul's missionary travel around Rome, around the Roman territories. And the phrase sometimes is used, they were from James. And it's fascinating because I don't think James sent these guys, but James was the pastor. This is the guy who wrote the book of James. James is one of the major pastors of the church in Jerusalem. Well, it had like 5,000 plus people in it. If you have a church that big, there's some oddballs in a congregation that big. There's oddballs in churches like 100 or less, I've heard. I don't know. I've heard, okay? So you can just imagine that amplified. You're going to get blocks. Is that making sense? You're going to get blocks. You're saying, well, I'm from James's church. I'm from James. No one can. They didn't have telephone. They couldn't call James up. Hey, did you send these guys over here to us? They couldn't do it. So this group from James was going around teaching people, you had to follow the law. You had to follow the law. You had to follow the law. And Paul is like, I didn't do any of that. It was revealed to me by his grace. I went, what does it says? I did not meet as a consultant, nor did I go to Jerusalem. So he literally says, I did not receive any training from the Jewish teachers in Jerusalem. It is recorded that he visited, but it's not like he trained and was taught under James's school, under Peter's school. This is it. So he's completely distancing himself from this, even the potential thought that he's teaching part one, and these teachers are actually teaching part two. He's trying to completely distance himself from any inkling or thought that he's teaching I don't know how to say it. a Judaizing Christianity, a Christianity under the law. He's completely trying to distance himself from that thought. So that's a quick read through, right? Now, what I wanted to bring out here, though, is really this big first point, okay? And if we just read and focus on the narrative portions, I think we could miss this. But when Paul tells his story, how he brings God into it is such a natural thing, we can skim right by it. I have. See, and he starts off in verse 11, though. He straight up says, this is not man's gospel. I did not receive it from man. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And then here he says in verse 15, but when he who had set me apart before I was born, he sort of sandwiches his narrative in between God and God. This is what's so cool about it. So there's these major things that we end up seeing here. And he says that in verse 15, he says, but when he had set me apart, and who called me by his grace, that I might reveal his son to me. I'm skipping ahead. Yeah, that I might preach. Yeah, was pleased to reveal his son to me, and in order that I might preach. You think about what Paul just said God did. Paul is saying that God selected him. God then influenced him or called him, influenced him by his grace, was then pleased to reveal his son to me, saved. That's all of us has that thought where we're like, is Jesus who we think he is? That's him. Once we come to that term, he saves us. In order that I might preach, God directed him. And I had these cool Duplos here, or Duplo blocks. Duplos is not a word. Don't tell my daughter I stole these from her. She has no idea. As you noticed, these are girl Duplos, or boy Duplos, or whatever they're supposed to be now. Now, you guys might look at this and, all right, so what thing? Oftentimes, we can get a little bent out of shape anytime we hear that God calls us, chose us, sets us apart, where God has anything to do with our salvation except for saving us. Some people have a difficult time reconciling God's choice and God's influence with man's free will. It just happens. And it's difficult. I wrestled with it for a while. And finally, I think I just had to come to a place where I'm like, it sort of started making sense to me to the best I could have it. What I concluded is, so oftentimes, there's two ways to view salvation experience, what goes on. You can either choose to view things from man's perspective, as of me, okay, so this is like my head, okay? So this is like my perspective. And in my world of, with all my other peoples and my peeps, we're pretty much equal. I do my thing. I have my choice. I do what I want. And that is how we live. We have very small views of reality and our experience. Everything is based on what I can see, what I can hear, what I can learn, what I read, who I talk to. That's pretty much the scope of me. All right? And then God. He is so big and immense, and all of us would agree, especially if we have, a Christian background, that if we believe that God is God, that means He is God of the universe, He is supreme, He is in control. These are statements we say oftentimes. Well, yeah, it don't matter this, God's in control. And we're like, God's in control, God's in control. But then suddenly, in regards to salvation, God's not in control because I have my choice. So the way I started looking at God's actions and my actions is really trying to look at them separately. I see me and I see my experience and in essence, my reality, I see through my eyes, and this is me. I really can't see very far, right? You guys see that? I mean, I couldn't see much past what I can see. Can you guys even see his eyes? No, it sort of disappears and everything. But when it comes to God, God is much, bigger, but God looks down and He sees all of these pieces. He knows their colors. He knows which sets they belong to, what families they go to. God has a pretty good idea of what's going on underneath them. And in God's plan, God really wants to build a really cool Duplo house. Okay? His probably matches and spells things, mine does not. And so what he'll do is he's like, I think this pink would go perfectly with this. And so he sets this block apart. But this block is still thinking, it's doing its own thing. And God in His wisdom, He is calling and drawing that individual to something better. You could be a part of something bigger. I died for you. I rescued you. And come check this out and be a part of it. And the block, because the block has his perspective, is like, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I believe. But on the big scene, God has set out that block. God has drawn that block. God has been calling this block to be a part of something bigger. And He's bringing that person in. And just like He did with so many of us, He calls, draws. He then eventually, with our decision to place our faith and trust in Jesus, He saves us. See, God has His thing that He is doing. We have our thing that's going on in our minds and what we see. And God calls and directs, and He wants us to do some pretty cool, exciting stuff. And that's what He does with Paul. And it's not just unique to Paul's experience. Paul isn't the only one who gets selected, influenced, and saved and directed by God. Paul is just one example of millions upon millions of Christians that God has selected, influenced, saved, and is directing you to do something really awesome. See, the gospel is God's message. The gospel is all about what God is doing. See, the gospel, and through the gospel, God has selected, He is influencing you, the gospel saves you, and the gospel should be directing you outward. The gospel is God's message. And what Paul begins to say here in the midst of his narrative and his story is God is doing this work inside of me and through me, and I'm just along for the ride. And it makes no sense. I was a human somebody, and I became a human nobody. And I'm trying to introduce you to the real somebody who is Jesus. It makes no sense. It literally makes no human sense. And I think that's the point. It's God's. This is God's story. This isn't my story. This is God's story. I just have a part in it. It's really cool. But he keeps going there, and I think this is what we're going to see in the last part. In verse 18, he says, "Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," that's Peter, "and remained with him for 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. I mean, that's really the tone of where he's having to really emphasize this to this group of people. So like I said, we're not there. We're not in the midst of this. But you can imagine if somebody like Paul is really having to drive home on this stuff, there must have been a lot of chaos going on in these churches. We don't exactly know what was being said, but Paul is literally having to speak and then re-emphasize, I'm not lying with this. Almost like you can check with this. You can verify these things. 15 days, that's pretty specific. I mean, somebody could go up to Peter. How much time did Paul spend with you down in Jerusalem? Oh man, like 2 weeks. That's verifiable, That's something like, okay, you can confirm this. Paul was not influenced by this Jewish thought that had sort of been, that people were trying to advocate for, that Paul was somehow teaching part one Christianity, but these other guys are actually teaching the full Christianity. They can't really do that. He says, then he went into the region of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. I am not from this Jewish branch of Christianity, Paul is saying. I have nothing to do with it. They were only hearing it said. And I love the rest of this verse. And then verse 24, this is what they were hearing about Paul. He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. I mean, think about that said about you. I mean, maybe you weren't an anti-faith, trying to murder people faith, trying to arrest people. But just imagine that said of you. Just imagine in your framework, this person was once like this, and now they are like this. And that is weird. And then Christians are like, that is awesome. It says, and they glorified God because of me. And that's the last one, is the gospel is for God's glory. See, God gets this thing started. God, he selects and he draws and he influences people and he draws people to himself. He saves people through the gospel and he directs people and he points them and sends us out in our circles of influence and the people we know and where we work and where we live and our families. He's like, I got stuff for you to do. I got people for you to serve. I got people for you to love on. I got a job for you. And it's not to point there, but it's ultimately so God is glorified. See, the gospel doesn't make us better. The gospel doesn't make us look better. The gospel is only supposed to make God look better. I mean, that's what it is. I think it's such a neat thing. So in Paul's first part of his autobiography, where he's trying to clarify and defend and create backbone and some backing to what he's about to deliver there at the end of chapter 2 and 3. He's getting this set up. But even in the midst of this autobiography, we can see something so naturally that comes from Paul's mouth. And that where Paul is today was all a result of God. And in our life, do we look at it that way? Do we acknowledge what God has done in our life to put us all where we are, February 2nd, 2020, 2220? Wow, that's a lot of twos today. Whoa. No way. Wow, rabbit trail there. That's incredible. But can you identify how God got you to where you are today? I mean, can you see in your own life, as Paul did, can you see that where you were drawn, where God brought you along? Can you see that point where you are saved and you placed your faith and trust in Jesus? And after you made that, can you see where God is directing you? Because I believe he's directing each of us. It's not like Paul's mission. That was Paul's thing. But I believe he has a job for each and every one of us. Can you articulate that? Or you're like, I just do things. Oh, come on. I think we can do better than that. What does God have you doing right now? Is it being a gospel mother to your children? But that doesn't sound cool. Are you kidding me? Being a mother to your children and pointing them to Jesus? There's like nothing cooler. God has a job for you right now. And own it. It's yours. He is directing you right now, whether it's your home or your work or you're at church or maybe you're retired and you're ministering to family in other states. I don't know what it could be. Can you define that for yourself? And then as you do this, you got to ask that question, is everything in my life, is it actually pointing to him? Do I even acknowledge God in the midst of my day? I mean, Paul does it so naturally here. I mean, I bet Paul sounded a little weird to people. I mean, and at times we even acknowledge that everything in my life is because of God. He's influenced, he's drawn, he is saved, he is directing me, and I thank and give him the glory on a regular basis. Because the gospel is all about God. It's his message to us, and through it, he has influenced, he has saved, he has directed, he is directing people, and all for his glory, because it's all his.